Today we start the ancient Mesopotamia and Persia section of our study. Here is a map of ancient Mesopotamia. You know, I always like to start with a map. On this map, you can see the cities of Uruk, Ur, Babylon, Kish, Eshuna, and Lagash. These particular cities are cities that are located near the Persian Gulf tributaries. Infrastructure of lakes and streams comes from the Persian Gulf into the area. And then we also see the Euphrates River that comes through. The river is important because it is what provides nourishing soil. So, especially in countries that have a very dry climate, drought is something that is a challenge in terms of farming. And so every year the river would flood, and it would bring with it a sense of, or a lasting mineral deposit system. So along the banks of the river, you get very good mineral deposits because all of the sea life nourished the water. And when the river would flood, it would then recede back, and what would be left is nutrients from the sea that were left on the riverbanks. The city-states that were along the riverbanks were often city-states that were very self-contained. If you lived in Uruk, you often didn't know anything about what life was like in the city of Ur. Each city-state had their own deities, their own patron god or goddess, and their local government was really the government that ruled in the area. So likely there was a person like a mayor, a person like a police force, a police chief that was in charge of keeping law and order. This caused most of the city-states to often be fighting with each other for natural resources. So the patron god or goddess of Ur would not be the same patron god or goddess of Uruk. And Ur was constantly seeking Uruk's natural resources and vice versa. It meant that the art that comes out of the ancient Near East is often warlike. They are excellent farmers. They farm so well that certain areas are specialized in the type of food. So we call this area the Fertile Crescent. It's the landmass that lies between Turkey and Syria and runs south into modern-day Iraq. So what are we going to see when we look at art in the ancient Near East? Art takes on the theme of an offering, offerings to the patron god or goddesses. We see depictions of god and goddesses. Warfare and hunting becomes prominent, and we see a hierarchy of socio-political structure. What forms are you going to see art in? For one, mud brick construction. Architecture is made in mud brick. There are natural and conceptual treatments of the figure, and we see registers of space and hierarchy of scale as ways to depict a narrative. And we're going to talk a lot about those registers of space and hierarchy of scale. So when we look at these ziggurats, it's hard to imagine this picture, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but it is in fact what history tells us these buildings served as. The layout of the cities reflect the role of the gods and goddesses that they worshipped. And the Sumerians create temple complexes that were cities within the city that they lived in. Priests, scribes, and all religious function was carried out in the temple complex. So Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love and war, and she's the same goddess as Ishtar. She's the patron deity of the city of Uruk. And she was the head Sumerian goddess. Like she was the I guess she would be the equivalent of Athena in Roman society. The sculpture of her head was stolen in the Baghdad War during the looting of the Iraq Museum. It has since been recovered and returned to Iraq's museum. The sculpture that you see here is the female head of Inanna. It's the sculpture that was stolen. Her head is made of stone, which is rare because the Middle East doesn't have large stones. So we know that they must have imported the stone into the city of Uruk. The face is the only part of the statue that actually has survived. They think that the rest of her body might have been made of wood or another less costly material. Historians speculate that this could be the facial representation of Inanna or a female priestess. In antiquity, the face would have been inlaid with colorful stones and vibrant jewels. The jewels would have been placed in the deep crevices of the brow and where the lines in the large eyes are. You see there's some damage on the nose. We don't know if that is damage from defacing or if it's just damage from it being old. You can see the ridge that goes down the front of the head. That would have had a hair attached made of some sort of natural material. This is the Worka vase. It's a Sumerian piece that is really important. It was also stolen during the looting in the Iraq War, but has since been recovered. In the middle register of the vase, we see a group of priests carrying offerings to the goddess Inanna. Inanna is the patron goddess of the area, and the vase was found in the temple complex and depicts the festivals that were given to Inanna. She's the same goddess that we saw pictured in the statue or the sculpture of the head. This is the oldest example of narrative art. The Sumerians were masterful at pictorial narration, and we can see the festival procession taking place. The men's baskets are full of offerings going to Inanna. And at the top, we see the formal presentation of the goods to Inanna in the temple. The bottom of the vase, water and flowers flow in hopes of a good harvest and blessings from Inanna. So let's talk a bit about vocabulary here in this slide, or in this work of art. First of all, do you see how the designs are separated into sections? Each section seems to have a line that the figures walk on. That is called a register. The line that the figures walk on is called a ground line. We also see, especially if you look to the right in this section that I've blown up for you of the work vase, the typical representation of an ancient Near Eastern person. You see what we call the frontal eye, the eye that looks as if it's coming out of the side of the head. You see what we call twisted perspective or composite view of the figure. So Ainana's feet stand towards the figure that is offering her the bouquet of goods. Her hips run parallel to the register line. They are parallel to you, the viewer, and so are her shoulders. But her head turns back towards the priest who is making an offering to her. This is called twisted perspective or composite view of the figure. You see in the priest a prominent brow ridge that shows the frontal eye. You see a long nose and small lips. I will keep pointing out these typical features of the frontal eye and the twisted representation of the body, as well as the prominent brow ridge and elongated nose and small lips. In the vase, the image or the narrative is separated by registers. Typically, the most important register, heaviest in narrative, is at the top. And that's the case here. The very top is the procession comes to a culmination of giving goods to Ainana. The lower register, the one at the very bottom, is the one that has the most naturalist looking animals. The importance of the figure moving towards the top. The figure at the top is more stylized. It has a stronger artistic hand to the representation. It doesn't look as much like the things that they're probably encountering in everyday life. Whereas the register at the bottom that has the goats and the water is more natural looking. It's more natural looking because it's less important, because the things that are in it are not as important as the upper register of Ainana. And the more natural looking the image is, typically means the less important it is. In the top register, we also see something called hierarchy of scale. Simply put, the largest thing in the image is the most important. In this case, in the detail of Ainana on the right, you can see that Ainana is the tallest of the figures. If you add her crown into consideration, she is the tallest person. She's also a little bit larger than the priest. Another thing that Sumerians invented were pictorial representations of worshippers who made donations. They are called votive offerings. One of the most common types of votive offerings I can think of, or a modern equivalent, would be when you go into Catholic Church, if you want to pray for your grandma or your sister, you would walk up to a stand and there would be candles sitting in front of you. And there was a box where you put a donation in the box and light a candle. That is called a votive offering. It's why we call the candle a votive candle. The candle's lit, it burns for a while, and it's supposed to be the representation of your prayer going to the heavens, requesting help from God. The worshipers that you see in front of you are the same thing. They stand and wait for the deity, the patron deity, to come and hear the prayer of the person who sponsors them. Some of the worshiper statues have inscriptions at the base that identify the worshiper or the person who bought them. They have a conical shape. They still retain the shape from the block of stone in which they were carved. The stone that they are carved from has a cone-like shape to it. And they hold a small vessel in their hands with libations in it for the god or goddess. The libation is a fancy word for a drink of wine. It's just it's an offering. The wine would be to the god or goddess. They're not portraits, but they do have distinguishing features that are representative of the donor who purchased them. These were excavated in the square temple in Ashuna. They are votive offerings. They were meant to be placed in the temple to stand in for prayer for a blessing of a family. We often talk about one of the statues in the next slide. Here, the woman who stands, she's the figure with the wrapper that comes around the front of the shoulder. She has small hands that hold a beaker for libations. And you see that there are these little feet here next to her. We don't know if they were hoping for a child, and so they added the feet, the original sculptor added the feet to the base of the statue, or if there was a child that maybe was lost in childbirth. The other example that stands behind the woman is a male worshiper. He's dressed as a typical Sumerian male would be. He has a wrapper that's skirt-like in appearance. It has raffia at the bottom. If you look at his head, his beard is represented in a cylindrical form that is arranged horizontally. Their eyes have these large circular disc shapes to them. That is because they lay in wait, watching for the god or goddess to return to the temple so that they can pray your prayer for the patron who purchased them. A lot of times the eyes were made of lapis lazuli, which is a really brilliant, bright blue material that was often used in ancient Sumerian art. It was a precious metal and something expensive. I used to carry a sample of lapis lazuli around so that you could look at it. Unfortunately, because we're not live in the classroom, I can't show it to you. The Sumerian woman is dressed the same way a typical Sumerian woman would dress. She has on sort of the sarong or a wrapper that comes underneath her underarm and up around her shoulder and down again towards her feet. So this is an image of the excavation of the royal tombs at Ur. It was excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. Woolley excavated the royal tombs at Ur for 12 seasons. 5 of them were spent excavating the royal tomb. 10 of the 16 tombs had mud brick chambers that were excavated. The other 6 were royal death pits with no separate structure for bodies. In the pits, there were lots of bodies. Servants were buried in jewels holding vessels. And you can see how they employed the people that lived in the area to help excavate the pits. You can see they did this in an assembly line type fashion where they would sort of pale one pail of rubble at a time and hand it up the line. There were many, many people involved in the excavation of the royal tombs at Ur. But one thing I want to be sure you understand is that the British Museum was the one that sort of led the excavation, and the University of Pennsylvania. There was a professor that was interested in the excavation. And so those are the people who were primarily responsible for discovering the artifacts in the royal tombs at Ur. So one of the questions that you're going to hear me ask in this unit is about appropriation. The British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania head up this excavation. When Sir Leonard Woolley was done excavating the pits, who do you think kept the artifacts that he found? If you guessed the British Museum, you are correct. The British Museum would have kept the things that Sir Leonard Woolley found in the excavation of the royal tombs at Ur. The professor who represented the University of Pennsylvania would have probably written and published work, as well as the University of Pennsylvania would have had some rights to the artifacts. My question for you is, how do you feel about the excavation of the royal death pits, and that the artifacts that were part of Iran and Iraq and people of the Middle East are now in a museum in Great Britain? Is that something that you think is right? You see, typically, in the very beginning of art history, especially in Egyptian excavation that we'll hear next week, there is a finders keepers policy on artifacts. In other words, if I'm the one that funded the dig, I'm the one that gets to keep this stuff. Do you think that that is unfair to the people of the Middle East in which that live in the area? Or do you think that the artifacts should have stayed in the Middle East? Let's keep going and we will look at that question again. All right, so here's an illustration of the royal death pits at Ur. This is what they found whenever they excavated them. They were located adjacent to the rulers' tombs, and over 70 people were found in the pits. They had offerings in their hands to give to the gods. CT scans have shown that the servants were killed using blunt trauma to the head and then laid in rows, dressed in finery as a presentation to the gods. There were wheeled carts and draft animals found in the king's tomb, and the tomb that we have found, we also have found in the tomb a bull harp and cylinder seals, as well as the standard of Ur. So in other words, we've found some really precious objects and some things that are really prominent in the history of art. The CT scan is one that they did on the remains. And what you're looking at here is sort of a artifact map. So when they uncovered the death pit, they would have had an artist draw how the artifact was found so that they had record of it. The strange contraption in the middle there is a cart, and this is how we know for sure that the Sumerians invented the wheel. The weird thing about this is the blunt force trauma to the head. Then the servant was dressed in finery and given an offering in the hands to go to the heavens. You see, the kings in Sumeria believed in divine kingship, that once they died, they would go to heaven and be a god. The people that were his servants here on earth, he wanted to take them with him. So you can look at in the ancient Near East and in the Egyptian art, they literally believe that you can take it with you when you go. And so anything that you need into the afterlife is going to be taken with you. So the servants need to be sacrificed. They would have been dressed in finery, not before the blunt trauma to the head, but after, and decorated in jewels. Literally, the servants were votive offerings. They were sacrifices that were made in dedication to the gods. This is the peace side of the standard of Ur. And we talked about in the beginning that the city-states in Ur were often at war with one another. A stele is a sign that's made to commemorate something. Modern day steles would be more like a plaque that commemorates the history of the town square, something of that nature. But the idea was that this was a work of art that was put on the end of a big stick. And it went with them in show whenever the military would ride out or go in a big troop to probably confront an enemy of sorts. The stele would be brought with them, and it was propaganda art. It was art that said, this is who we are, this is our power, and this is what we do to you if you challenge that power. Sometimes these marked graves, but in this case, it was made to commemorate battle. We see composite view in the way that the figures are represented. Once again, the feet stand on the ground line, pointed to the right or to the left. The shoulders are parallel to the viewer, and the head is then turned parallel to the feet. So I challenge you to stand like this. I do this every semester. I'll stand with my feet one way, my chest another way, and my head going the opposite way. And you'll realize that it's really not a natural way to stand. Most people that stand like this fall over because we don't typically put our feet one in front of the other in a line, nor do we turn our head to the sideways and have our chest going in a completely opposite direction. It's just really unnatural feeling. You'll notice that the lowest register has the most natural looking images, and the people stand not in composite view, but in regular view, just like they would if they were walking towards down a hallway. Each section is divided by a register. So you've got a ground line, and each section is sort of banded together to create some unity within that band to tell the story or the narrative. At the very top, you see the most important people. They are banqueting, and you see the king here in the upper right hand. Let me see if I can make this little tool work. Here, this is the king. Here is the naturalism, and this here to here, here to here, and here to here at the top is a register. All of the king's military or priests sit facing him, and they're banqueting. They're banqueting in the afterlife. They're celebrating before a big battle. You can see in the center register, we've got some more natural looking images of animals, and some people that are a little bit more natural looking. They are being presented as offerings to the king here at the top. We know the king is the king because of hierarchy of scale. This figure here in the upper left-hand corner is the king. He's the tallest. He's so tall that he breaks the register at the top. The material that is inlaid in the background is lapis lazuli. They are thin layers of lapis lazuli. cut and laid into the stele. And at the very bottom, the people are made of a shell material. If you look at the inside of a shell, it has sort of a rainbowy, opalescent hue. Those shells are the ones that are used to create the figures. This work of art is at the British Museum, and it is a very beautiful work of art. I know that it's hard to sort of see that when you're just looking at an image of it through a slide, because you can't see the materials, you can't see how it shines and catches the light, but it is quite beautiful. The red stones would have been some sort of red coral or rubies. Let's look at the other side of the standard of Ur. Well, this is a close-up of the king. So you can see that the king wears a much more fancy skirt wrapper than the priests who he's talking with. They hold libations in their hands. And we see this ancient Sumerian pictorial device that is characteristic or hallmark of ancient Sumerian art. That prominent brow ridge, the frontal almond-shaped eye that looks out at the viewer, an elongated nose, and a small chin and small lips. Here is the war side of the standard of Ur. It is very opposite from the peace side. The peace side, they're banqueting and sort of playing nice. In the war side, we see propaganda. It's propaganda that says, hey, if you are to cross us, this is what will happen to you. The very bottom register, this register here, has the most naturalist looking animals. The people in the center register that are captives are actually very natural looking. The ones that are highly stylized are actually military, serving the king. At the top, you can see that the king breaks the register, and these are the people who are being presented to him. We're going to take a close-up look at the horses that pull the chariots. I told you that the Sumerians invented the wheel. This is the first appearance of a four-wheeled cart in the history of art. And we know that they invented the wheel because it's the first time we've ever seen wheels being used. If you look closely, the general stands in the back of the chariots with another general that rides at his side. And he controls horses who have people underneath them as captives. This is the detail of the lowest register in the standard of Ur, and I wanted to show you a close-up of the pictorial device that they use to show motion in the horse. I know it's a little pixelated, a little fuzzy because of blowing up the small close-up section, but I just wanted to show you this pictorial device that they use to show motion. You see how the horse is walking and it has four legs, but the four legs seem to be repeated over and over again, going backwards. That repetition is supposed to represent movement. It's the idea, I don't know, sometimes on comic book cartoons, you'll get those little sort of curvature lines around hands or something like that that show movement. It comes from this idea, the pictorial device of repetition, showing that the animal moves throughout space and has depth to it. We're going to see that the ancient Sumerians used this a lot to show movement, especially in larger sculptures. This is the bull-headed harp with an inlaid sound box from the tomb of Pu'abi at the Royal Cemetery of Ur in Iraq. It also is at the British Museum. You can see that the calf or the bull's head is leafed in gold. His beard is made of lapis lazuli. In the image on the right, the horns are actually made of ivory, whereas the image on the left, the horns are gilded in gold. And this was real gold leafing here. You see at the edge of the sound box registers with mythological scenes in them. Now, I don't know much about ancient Sumerian religion, so I can't sort of decipher the scenes for you or tell you who they represent. I just know that they had to do with the afterlife. Obviously, we know that the kings and people of Sumeria believe in an afterlife. If they did not, they would not have sacrificed the servants. They would not have had all of these items buried in the royal tomb with them. They think that they carry these objects with them into heaven. The bull harp was created sort of like an ancient guitar. It has a bridge, which is that rectangular thing that the strings are lifted up on through the sound box. And then at the top, they have wooden tools that are used to pull a string taut. The strings themselves are made of sinew, which is basically bull intestine. And when the string is plucked, it creates a vibration which comes through the sound box. So basically an ancient guitar. And we know that they would have used the bull harps in playing of festivals. This is a cylinder seal. Cylinder seals are really fascinating. They're very fascinating pieces of art and artifacts. Some art that we study really, it's hard to separate art versus artifact because they're both, right? Like this is both. It's something that was found in the royal death pits at Ur, but it's also a work of art. The idea is that the cylinder seal is about 2 inches in total. You roll it out on a piece of mud brick clay, and it leaves behind a pattern. The cylinder seal were used often to seal important documents. They were part of security, so if a chest or a document or a doorway was sealed shut and then marked with a cylinder seal, if the seal had been broken, you would know it and know that your security had been compromised. You can see that they are made of some sort of heavy stone, and they're meant to last a very, very long time. Oftentimes, only people with upper class status who were able to read and write would carry the cylinder seal around their neck in a necklace. In this particular scene, the cylinder seal stamps a story of banqueting, ceremonial banqueting. You see sort of a more naturalistic representation of a person, but still has that ancient Sumerian frontal eye with the composite view of the body. The idea is that the cylinder seal is carved. The design is scooped out of the surface of the cylinder seal, And so when it rolls across clay, any place where the design has been hollowed out, the clay will then go into and it creates an image. They're fairly small, they're about 2 inches tall. And like I said, they were a status symbol. They were a symbol of leadership, they were a symbol of power, they were a symbol of financial security, because only people who the king really trusted would have the cylinder seal. All right, so we're moving on to the artwork of Akkad. I just want to tell you that you don't have to be able to remember what is Akkadian, what's Sumerian, what's Neo-Babylonian. You just should know that this is all ancient Near Eastern art. You can see the iconoclasm more so in the eye that's been gouged out here. This one to my right. Now, originally in antiquity, a precious material might have been inlaid into the eyes, but this gouging out of the eye is a gouging out of the eye that is a form of disrespect. The most common parallel of modern society that I can relate to you is when Saddam Hussein was captured and taken out of Baghdad. The people had such disdain for him that they toppled over the square, or toppled over the statue that sat in the town square, and gouged out his eyes in the statue. This is the same thing. Gouging out the eyes is a sign of disrespect, and the people who were conquered, the people who, the conquering nation after the Akkadians, gouge out the eyes and the head of Sargon. Sargon is made with a process called the lost wax process. The lost wax process is an important technology. It's a technology that seems to tell what power in society is. It seems to be an indication of a strong society. It's part of sort of a research and development kind of indication in society. Being able to cast things out of the lost wax process is something that takes technology, it takes knowledge, and it's why we mark it as a sort of milestone of sophistication in society. So I just wanted to give you a quick slide about how the lost wax process works. Kind of gives you an idea of how the sculpture is made, and then a cast is made out of it, and then bronze is poured inside the sculpture to create a sculpture out of bronze. Here is on the right a modern day version of what the lost wax process looks like in the day and age of fiberglass and plastic modern materials. If you're interested in the lost wax process, I suggest that you look it up on YouTube. It's a really fascinating process. So this is a victory stele of Naram Sin. Naram Sin is the guy at the very top of the mountain. You can see he's the largest of the people. There's that use of hierarchy of scale. You see 3 suns at the very top of the stele. That is representation of polytheism, a polytheistic society. The victory stele commemorates the battle between Naram-Sin and his victory over the Lulube people of the ancient Near East. The artist uses hierarchy of scale to indicate who Naram-Sin is, and twisted perspective to give the most information possible to the viewer about who Naram-Sin is. The Lulube are more naturalistically represented. They have a truly agonizing display of defeat. You can see the mountain in the background and the two Lulube people standing in front of it. One woman sort of begging for mercy, and one man kneeling at Naram-Sin's feet, pulling an arrow out of his throat. The men who stand underneath Naram-Sin's feet are Naram-Sin's generals. And you can see that the artist uses registers, but he puts them on a diagonal. And it creates a more dramatic looking work of art. We get a sense that the warriors, Naram-Sin's warriors, are giving thanks to the gods for their victory, kind of based on the motion that they have of this sort of praying motion with their hand across their chest. The registration is used so that the figures don't overlap each other, and it creates a sense of depth. The registration has a ground line. The other thing I want to tell you about this work of art has to do with what we call a worthy adversary. So the best way I can explain this to you is to sort of compare it to what we usually compare things to in Ohio, which is football, right? So the football rivalry between OSU and Michigan. Let's say that Naram-Sin represents OSU and the Lulube people are Michigan. If a stele had been made of OSU playing Ohio Dominican, do you really think it would have been that powerful of a stele? In other words, you're really not going to advertise that you defeated an enemy unless they were your noble adversary. They were someone who you looked at as your equal, and that you defeated, meaning that the defeat was something to commemorate, the defeat was something that was important. If it was Naram-Sin defeating, or if it was Ohio State defeating Ohio Dominican, no big deal. But Ohio State defeating Michigan, that's something to hurrah about. Very similar to the stele in that Naram-Sin is the Lulube people and Naram-Sin are worthy adversaries of each other. So defeating the Lulube people is something that is a noble defeat. This is the votive disc of Iduana from Iraq. And the disc, I've blown up this picture for you, and unfortunately it looks a little fuzzy. So I've included this schematic drawing here at the lower right-hand side. This votive disc is a disc that was created to honor the moon god. Iduana was a priestess of the moon god. You can see her pictured in the drawing as the most elaborately dressed, as well as she is the tallest of the people there. She's dressed in a robe that has many layers, and if you remember the victory stele of, if you remember the standard of Ur, the king was sitting wearing a tiered skirt, very much like Iduana's skirt or dress is here pictured in the votive disc. The disc was an honoring of the moon god. Iduana was a daughter of King Sargons, and she is the first recorded poet. This is the ziggurat of Ur. The temple was built by the Sumerian kings. Its base is a solid mass of mud brick laid in bitumen. Bitumen is a dark colored material. It is made of small loose stone, but is very hard when it's all glued together in the mud brick composition. So it's used as mortar between the mud bricks. It is a temple that is built to the patron goddess Inanna, the patron goddess of Sumeria. This ziggurat is much better preserved, and I think it's because of the use of the bitumen. It is mud brick and bitumen compared to the one in Uruk, which was highly weathered and decomposed due to rain and wind erosion. This is Gudea. Gudea is a scholar, and he makes statues of himself to put into temples, temples that are given to the gods as votive offerings. Gudea is a scholar. He knows how to read and write. You can see that he's sitting here with cuneiform all over his skirt, which, remember, that's the writing that the Sumerians invented. Gudea is, he comes from the philosophy that city-states are better political, sort of a better political structure than an absolute monarchy. And so he wants the absolute monarchy like Sargon to go away. And he wants the power of the government to return to the city-states. He builds many temples in his honor. Here to the right, you can see him holding a jar. The jar has water in it flowing down Gudea's robe, and Gudea says that it represents the many blessings that God has bestowed upon him. There's an important inscription on Gudea's skirt. It says, "This statue has not been made from silver, nor lapis lazuli, nor from copper, nor from lead, nor yet from bronze. It is made of diorite." Diorite is a very hard material. It's a material that is precious and rare. It is something that the Egyptians use a lot to carve their statues out of. But Gudea doesn't have lots of access to diorite. And so he's pointing out that the statue is made of diorite because it means that the statue is more expensive, and it took more effort to carve it. All the statues that we have found of Gudea have been found in temples to intercede to the gods on Gudea's behalf. This is a portrait of him. Other things that Gudea gives thanks to God for, he gives God the thanks for giving him physical strength. He was a builder of temples, and he financially funded all the temples that we have found his statues in. Akkad has now been taken over by a group of people called the Elamites. They ruled the territory east of the Tigris River, and their government falls from the centralized organization into city-state structure again. When it comes to ancient Near Eastern art, this is one of the most important pieces of ancient Near Eastern art that we have. It is a piece of art that is about Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a powerful king of Babylon, and he unites Sumeria again. So he believes in the divine kingship and one king ruling all of the city-states as one king, compared to Gudea that we just saw that wanted the return of the city-state structure. Hammurabi in Sumeria's time was known for his conquests. In our time, he's known for his laws. Our democratic law system is based on this stele that you see in front of you. The laws that are prescribed, also there are prescribed penalties for everything that happens in society, from stealing to adultery. In this work of art, we see hierarchy of scale. We see lots of cuneiform. We see divine kingship. And so let me show you a close-up of the two figures. So this is a close-up of Hammurabi and Shamash, the top image of the stele of Hammurabi. And you can see right underneath the area where Hammurabi's feet and Shamash rest his feet on is cuneiform. The cuneiform is what the law code is written based on. When we look at the image of Hammurabi and Shamash together, we see a solution to a common problem that we see in art that depicts a power differential. So the power differential is between Shamash, who is the sun god and the god of fairness, I believe, the god of justice, and Hammurabi. Hammurabi's king. He wants to make himself look important, but he definitely doesn't want to look more important than a god or goddess. And so Shamash is seated on a throne in front of Hammurabi, and he's handing Hammurabi the law code. This is Shamash's way of saying, here are the laws, I want you to implement them to your people. You see that Shamash wears a crown that looks like it's made of bull horns, and he has a long beard that is represented in horizontal rows. Shamash wears a fanciful tunic with that tiered, layered effect in the robing. Shamash sits on a throne with his feet up above Hammurabi's, and underneath his feet, sort of a pedestal from the throne. This depiction of the feet not hitting the ground indicates Shamash as being holy. It also indicates him as being part of the sun. You have those waves of light coming from behind his shoulders. He is represented in composite view because the shoulders parallel the viewer and the feet angled towards Hammurabi. Hammurabi raises a hand to take the law code from Shamash, and he appears, at least with a hat on, to be about the same height as Shamash when Shamash sits down. However, if Shamash stood up, he would tower over Hammurabi, so much so that Hammurabi would look unimportant. This is a depiction of hierarchy of scale. I suppose you could say it's a depiction of a register that would be a bit of a stretch. There is a ground line that Hammurabi and Shamash stand on and rest upon, but there's no top line, so calling it a register is a little bit of a stretch. You can see the cuneiform. This work of art is in the Louvre. I have seen it firsthand. It is probably about 5.5 feet tall, but when you walk up to it, you see this image of Hammurabi and Shamash. Why is our United States law code modeled after it? It has the clear laws written out in cuneiform and their penalties for disrespecting them. I think that the laws that it represents are traditionally laws that are sort of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Some of them say things like, if you commit adultery, then your neighbor has the right to gouge your eyes out, or something hideous such as that. But anytime someone would have a problem within the community, like let's say I owned a farm and my farm got flooded in the rain, and the rain ran off in my neighbor's yard and killed all of his cows. The stele would tell me exactly how many cows I owed my neighbor. And so people were able to put faith in it and collectively obey the rules that are set forth by Hammurabi. Because they look at Hammurabi as a divine king who is taking the law code from Shamash, they look at it as if it was the law coming from the gods. So this is Citadel of Sargon II. A citadel is basically a city with a wall built around it. In the Neolithic time, we talked about Jericho. It was a fortified city, but not quite a citadel. A citadel is a full-fledged working city within the walls. In the citadel, we see lots of these winged bull statues called the Lamassu. The Lamassu wears the crown. You just saw a crown very similar to this one in Shamash, that Shamash wears in Hammurabi's stele. But here you see that there is a sense of worship of the bull. We call this a composite creature because there are definitely more than one creatures represented in the statue. You've got the crown of the bulls, the wings of a bird, and then the bottom half is of a herding animal with lion-type feet. If you walk around to the side of the Lamassu, you see that the feet sort of switch positions, and you get the side profile view. But if you stand in front of the Lamassu, you get the 2 feet planted firmly parallel to the viewer. It shows movement. It shows the most information that it can show all at once. King Sargon's face is on the Lamassu, and you see the hallmark of ancient Sumerian art with the prominent brow ridge, the wide-set almond-shaped eye, the elongated nose, and the small lips. Sargon has a beard that runs horizontally with a distinct pattern on it. You can see the repetition of pattern being used here in the bull's wings and the underbelly of the bull. And of course, you have these great big huge lion paws for feet. This Lamassu sat in the entrance of Sargon's citadel, and every time there was a doorway, you would see a pair of these Lamassu. They were to intimidate the viewer. They are very large. They're 13 feet tall, almost 14. And you feel very much like they're very massive and looking down upon you. That type of art is what we call propaganda art. It's art that sort of has a negative, prideful connotation to it. It is to persuade the viewer to not mess with King Sargon's territory. This is an image of the Lamassu as they flank the entrance of the citadel. There were many pairs of Lamassu, and in this case you have Sargon's face, but the hooves of some sort of goat-type creature, and the beard looks a little bit different. So these are the Syrian archers, and it's a relief carving from the Northwest Palace of Ashurnasirpal. Ashurnasirpal. If you go to the British Museum, you can see an entire depiction of these type of relief carvings. One of the Delve Deepers offers you the opportunity to explore that at the British Museum. But as this goes, this is a relief carving. It is low relief. And in some places, like where the castle doors are, you see sunken relief. It is about royal power and the piety of the king. The relief carvings like this one record official ceremonies, rituals, battled victories, and slaying of wild animals. It is a testament to the king's power and wealth. And hunting was considered a testament to the king's power because he had the bravery to kill an animal that was ferocious and dangerous. The reliefs cover the lower part of the mud brick wall in the palace, and they were often painted. This particular relief depicts a battle that happened in 878 when Assyrians drove enemy forces to the Euphrates River. And this is a display of power. The idea of see what happens when you try to take us down. The men that are swimming with these interesting ancient scuba gear. It would have probably been the bladder of an animal or the stomach of an animal. And they strapped it to their bodies, put a straw in a seam of the animal, and put air in it so that they could vary their height in the water. The scene where the three men are take place in the water. You can see the background lines that are squiggly that indicate that that terrain is water. Then in front of them, you see a composite view of the king practicing the hunt. Again, a show of power. And behind the three men standing on the riverbank are soldiers of the king's men. There's some naturalism in the trees, but for the most part, this is a highly stylized image. The image contains scenes to commemorate an event that would have taken place over a span of time, where when you look at this particular relief carving, you don't really see that this represents a story that took place over a couple of years. It feels like it's all in one spot, just talking about one isolated incident. But that is not the case here. It is sort of a pictorial conglomeration of how the battle went. You can see the generals standing on the bank of the river ready to shoot an arrow to protect the king. You see some naturalism in the trees, but for the most part, this is a highly stylized piece. It is a composite view because when we're looking at the king, he's looking outward. It's a side profile, whereas the men that are swimming, we're sort of looking on top of. Well, last but not least, this is the Ishtar Gate. In the Delve Deepers, one of the Delve Deepers is about the Ishtar Gate. I highly encourage you to read about it. The Ishtar Gate is quite fascinating. It's a Neo-Babylonian piece. We call it Neo-Babylonian because it's the time where Nebuchadnezzar, who was Assyrian, took over the Akkadian Empire. Each brick is molded and glazed individually. So if you can just imagine that each brick is glazed specifically for the spot that it is in. So let's look at the laser pointer here. Like, let's say we just talk about this one brick right here. That one particular brick is molded specifically custom for that spot. And because of that, trying to take the Ishtar Gate down and then reassemble it seems as if it is an impossible feat. We see mythological figures on the gate, as well as real animals that are associated with power. This dragon over here, his name is Marduk. And then you have other lions and Pegasuses and horses. But the Ishtar Gate was a gate that was very, very tall, and the bricks were fired with a glazing of lapis lazuli. Let's look at how the Ishtar Gate was used. Here you can see a recreation or an artist's drawing of how the Ishtar Gate was used. It was a gate in which anybody who wanted to enter the town would have to pass through in order to enter it. And it was a propaganda piece of sorts because it showed power. It showed power in the sense that there was something really great that they had built. They had done it with technology that was highly individualized, and they did it so that it was an example of the king's power. So all of the animals that are on the front of it are powerful animals. And every time something major happened in the city, you had to pass through this gate in order to get in and out of the city. And that in itself makes this a piece of propaganda art. I hope you enjoyed the art of the ancient Near East. Please do your Delve Deeper activity and the quiz. And I hope you have a good week.